Welcome to this podcast of the People's Press Project. I'm Cindy Gomez-Schempp, and today we are going to talk about Moorhead Community Access Media, MCAM, our local public access station. You can find more about this podcast and story at www.fmppp.org. Today we'll be doing an interview with Malkia Cyril. www.womenonline, WIMNonline.org, has this to say about her. Malkia Cyril is a 30-year-old queer black writer, organizer, and media strategist. A working-class Brooklyn native, Malkia has worked with racial and economic justice youth, community, and activist groups in the San Francisco Bay Area for the past 9 years. As director of the Center for Media Justice and co-founder of the Media Justice Network, Malkia's goals are to build the strategic communications capacity of the progressive movement to move a racial and economic justice agenda, and to build power of youth and other marginalized communities to hold corporate media accountable for biased content and policy. She believes that communications is a human right and should not be for sale. Malkia was recently featured in the documentary Outfoxed and is primary author of numerous articles and studies, including Speaking for Ourselves and Is KMEL the People's Station? Currently, the Oakland-based Center for Media Justice has pushed policies to better serve disadvantaged communities so they have access to media through affordable broadband and local media that directly serves the community. We are honored to have you here today to talk about this important issue of access. Thank you, Malkia Cyril, and welcome.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Just to start talking about this issue a little bit, what we're really talking about today is the Moorhead Community Access Media Center, which is the only public access station for a four-city area. So to Dilworth and Moorhead, and in the North Dakota side, Fargo and West Fargo. And this is the largest metropolitan area between the Twin Cities and Spokane, Washington. So we consider this to be a very important access point for the community. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the past year is a steady decline in the access to the services that are available, even through just the one station. So that is what our issue is about, is to really change how people think about public access in our local community, and to try to explain the importance of public access, to kind of educate the public about what their communication rights are, what their community public access station should or could look like, and who better than to really help elucidate that issue than you. So I'd like to start off by just letting you talk a little bit about your background in media and media justice, and why you think that public access is such an important issue to a community.
Well, thank you so much. As you mentioned, my mom was a Black Panther and was very interested in the impact that coverage of that movement had on its ability to survive and thrive. We all remember, either through our own memories or through what we watched on television or read, that the coverage of the Black Panther Party led directly to its demise. What we know is that public opinion shapes policy, and when you don't have an informed electorate, when you don't have access to information, when you don't have a way to communicate, the community loses its cohesion. Our media outlets, the media outlets that we build as a community, the ones that serve directly people who otherwise might not have access to certain types of information, those outlets are the lifeblood of a community. They not only provide information and analysis about social issues, but they also provide opportunities for leadership development. They create economic paths to survival for local communities. all over this country, there are local broadband, there are community broadband outlets that are providing jobs to thousands and thousands of people. There are public access stations that provide jobs to thousands and thousands of people. So this isn't just an issue of whether or not we have access to information. This isn't just an issue of whether or not we have the right and power to speak freely. This is also an economic issue. This is an example when we see community media being defunded around this country, what we're seeing is local communities being defunded. We're seeing cities being defunded. We're seeing states being defunded. And what we're seeing getting funded are mega corporate giant internet and media companies that then also, by their very nature, shape our ability to speak to one another, to make political decisions, to find and access jobs, to find and access social services. So this isn't a simple issue. This isn't simply about whether or not some local person gets to make sock puppets on the air. This is about our right to free speech, and that's why I care about it.
And you make such an important point about the importance of public access, but one of the tough things that we've faced as a small media justice organization here in the middle of the Midwest is, well, one, telling people that we even have a public access station and how it's funded, and explaining that history of public access, which I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about in a moment, but also explaining what the relevance of public access is in this new age of technology, and, you know, getting people to make the connection between the potential of what a community that has access to the Internet and has a different means of broadcasting information, what that can mean for public access. Could you talk a little bit about those two things?
Well, when I think about the potential of public access to support and transform communities, what comes to my mind is, like I mentioned before, there is an economic benefit to having community stations of any kind, whether they be broadcast or internet or paper, community media outlets that are print-based. So there's an economic opportunity there for local communities. In addition to that, I think that when local communities have to make political decisions about who they're going to vote for, when local communities have to make political decisions about their budgets, when local communities have to make political decisions about their schools and about their health care, across this country, many local communities no longer have the mainstream journalism outlets that once existed. But they have, and what they should continue to have, are local community-based media outlets that are run by people just like them, who are trained and who have some background in being able to provide this kind of information. But I think the point that I'm making here is that these qualified, dedicated servants of our community who are reaching out to gather this information and share it with our community are people just like the people that they serve, which I think is a little bit different when you're dealing with the mainstream, huge news outlet. The disappearance of print journalism, the disappearance of newspapers means that now more than ever, community media is an absolute necessity. It's not a privilege. It's not extra. It is the only mechanism to get that kind of information to local communities. So I think that the potential for community media is brilliant. Is the potential of a community itself. It's not separate from the ability of the community itself to thrive.
Well, that's exactly what we have seen, what you're describing. It's always interesting to hear that as a community we're not that different. We're not alone in this public access issue, that public access stations all across the country have been defunded, that, the change from when the franchise monies were required to be used for public educational and government programming, PEG programming, and now that there's a more of a city-by-city decision-making on what and how much will be given for the use of public access. What we've noticed is that in our community, what that means is there's a real big difference, a stark difference in how public access is provided as a service to communities and what services are available. For example, in Detroit Lakes, which is not too far away, about an hour away, and in Jamestown, which is another city that's pretty close by, they have great public access stations. A person like me could walk off the street with no knowledge of broadcasting or editing or production or marketing or anything and say, I want to have a public forum with my local candidates. I want this to be done, and it can be produced and put on the airwaves. Here we don't have, the same access. We have one studio. It has very limited equipment. Many of it is old. So with technology changes so quickly, that makes one thing that you bought 1 year obsolete in 2 or 3 years. It's really difficult for us to figure out what is a public access station supposed to do. How do we translate that when there's such a difference between different communities and what they have? What, ideally, in your opinion, should a public access station be able to do for a community? How can it be used? What kind of equipment and staffing should there be? And you were talking earlier that thousands of people can be employed through it. I can't even fathom. Can you give us some insight into what you think it should be like?
I would say that there are people out there that can answer that question better than I. What I can tell you today is that in Mississippi and North Carolina, there are community broadband outlets that host radio stations, that host print outlets, that provide Internet access at the same time to thousands of people, that in each one of those projects, right, through that outlet, employs dozens and dozens of people. So I think that, one thing that we have to think about in terms of thinking about public media is how do we interface with digital technologies that allow us to reach more people, allow us to serve more people, and allow us to employ more people and do more things. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is, when folks are concentrating on production, sometimes they forget about policy. And the fact is that the defunding of public media is a direct result of political decisions that were made in Washington, D.C., that most of the people who are producing this media had no say in. I think that turning our attention, at least part of it, to, franchising rules and making sure that there is a standard for quality, but also a standard for financing across the country. There should not be poor districts and rich districts when it comes to public media. This is a standard service that everyone deserves, and there's a quality that everyone deserves. You can't produce that quality if you don't have the money. So we need policy that finances and funds our local media. And the last thing that I'll say about this is one of the reasons that across this country, for example, internet giants can preempt community broadband is because of is a direct consequence of the Supreme Court validating corporate personhood into law. That not only provided the basis for internet giants to say that local community broadband outlets are violating their right to profit by existing, but it also gives strength and power to larger media outlets like Comcast and others who have been mandated by law to provide percentages of their monies to community media outlets. The stronger they get, the better, the more they are able to consolidate power, both political power and financial power, the less power a community media radio or public access station has. So we have to be able to turn our attention to the rules as well as the creation of this media, because without rules that support production, without rules that finance production, we can't produce.
Now, this is very true. And one of the touchy subjects that you kind of talked about a little tiny bit in what you just said that I'm going to ask you to flesh out much more directly is how different places are funded. You know, there shouldn't be rich areas and poor areas. What we see in our community that really pushed Duke and I and has been the basis of a lot of our previous work and our past work histories is working on race issues, because what we've seen is very desperate outcomes for different communities. We've had a problem in Moorhead for a long time where we have a very small population of Black and Latino students in the school in terms of population overall, but in the alternative school, they represent about 60+% of the children that are in that school, which has been called by several justice groups as de facto segregation in our community. We've had a study that was done 10 years ago that was done by the Minnesota Advisory Council to the Department of Civil Rights about our community's outcomes for people of color in areas of public safety, in areas of education, and in the areas of economic sustainability. And what they found, they called this latent discrimination, latent racism that they felt might be very difficult for people in this community to overcome unless they looked at directly and addressed. We felt very strongly when we started the People's Press Project that media justice is the foundation of how we understand each other in a community, and what we see of each other and what we think of each other and how those stories are told is crucial to all of those areas of success for everyone in the community, in education, in work, and in justice. Would you please talk a little bit about how a lack of public access impacts communities of color and why it is so crucial for us to address the issue of desperate outcomes in our community when talking about media justice?
At the Center for Media Justice, we believe that cultural change precedes political change. And when you have the power and right to communicate, you therefore have the power to shape conditions and opinions and affect hearts and minds. Racism is not interpersonal. There may be bias that's interpersonal, but racism is structural, and it is organized by policies, regulations that have a historical context and that are in relationship to each other. So institutions are in relationship to each other, creating systemic oppression. This set of conditions, whether you're talking about disparities in healthcare, or you're talking about disparities in education, or you're talking about over-incarceration or disproportionate incarceration of youth of color or adults of color, no matter what issue you're talking about, the need for cultural change, and that means a shift in our understanding about what is possible, right, that equity is possible, a shift in our understanding about resources and how they get allocated, a shift in our beliefs and assumptions about rights, who has the right to do what. All of these are grounded in worldviews and beliefs that guide how we vote, who we choose to be in office, how much we think the healthcare industry should be funded, all of these political decisions are grounded in beliefs and assumptions. When you don't have a way to have the public conversation, have the public debate about race and about racism, the impact disproportionately falls on communities of color. So on the one hand, one issue is that you must have a vehicle for cultural discourse and cultural change, which I believe community media is an extraordinarily valuable vehicle for cultural change. Second, people of color are disproportionately marginalized from public debates in general, but also disproportionately rely on local community media. So just as in the wireless, in terms of thinking about wireless, people of color and youth in particular of color disproportionately use wireless devices as their primary access to the Internet. At the same time, wireless companies target youth of color as consumers. They fight against regulations that would protect those consumers. So while big media companies, both Internet and not, are gouging communities of color in terms of price on media devices, right, on access, they are also lobbying against their basic interests and rights in Washington. So what we have is a situation where people of color are disproportionately relying on alternative means of accessing public debate and at the same time being lobbied against by those who own the vast majority of the vehicles for public debate. So what you see is that community media finds a sweet spot. It is a vehicle that is not only disproportionately used, but is an absolute necessity for communities that have been pushed out of mainstream access.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said it more beautifully than that. But I have to bring up the issue that's going on at the local station for a minute, because I think it's really important to get back to a local analysis of what's been going on in juxtaposition to what's happening everywhere else. And that is, in this discussion, the People's Press Project has, for the last 2 years, been providing something that has never been seen around here. We're the only media justice organization in operation here, which is teaching people about their communication rights, that they are not just consumers of media, but that they are creators of media, that they actually have a duty to communicate back what they see, what they hear, to impart information about themselves, about their issues, about their community. That duty is literally part of the fourth estate of making sure that there is checks and balances in what's happening in our democracy, you know. It wasn't necessarily well received. It wasn't necessarily something that people saw a need for or a reason for. In fact, we had many people that were surprised that there was the possibility that the news could broadcast something that wasn't true, like a tight shot from CNN of when they were taking down the statue of Saddam Hussein, making it look like there was a lot of people that were supporting this this action by the military and by the people, when in fact it was a very small amount of people that were in that square. And when we showed people the real picture from far away, people were really shocked. And it started to dawn on them that there could be more of these misstatements and skewed facts that they might have missed in their lifetime, you know, and presently. We also started to do taping of government meetings, even in places where the infrastructure had already been created for those entities to have the funding and the equipment to tape themselves and put those meetings out for people to see in the public. because they said that they'd voted that they did not want to be filmed. We continue to keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on there because we feel that if we created those avenues, if we could show people that it could be seen a different way over time, they'd see the need for that transparency in local government, and they would jump on the opportunity to start doing that themselves. And that tide did start to turn. We then went to this local access and only access station and began training people there on the community that wanted to do community journalism on the equipment that was available to tape other government programs and then also to do their own broadcasting. And at that point is when we were taken, the cameras were taken away, the studio was dismantled. We were told that we weren't capable enough as citizens or as trainers that had already been using the equipment for a long time to broadcast these government programs and shows, that we weren't capable of training or teaching other people, and that the people weren't capable of using that equipment. And basically, there was all sorts of excuses given to take away the access, to limit the use of the only studio in town. And as this conversation moves forward, what we've been saying is, this isn't an issue about individual memberships or access for this Media Justice organization or any other private nonprofit or any other individual. This is an issue of what our public access station could and should be doing. And we feel very strongly that we need to defend it for its own sake, because if public access stations don't stay relevant, they can lose their funding. They are losing their funding all across the country. And so my last question to you about this, in looking at the situation and trying to maybe help wake up our local access station, I think they're operating out of naivete and staying on this one subject when there is a much broader issue here that we need to tackle. And that is, how do they go about making sure that they have funding in the future? Looking at how do the cities approach cable companies in order to ensure ongoing funding for public access?
I think the question that you're asking is a question that everyone is asking. So one of the things that I think people in Moorhead should know is that they are not alone. All over this country, that question, how do we secure funding for our public access station, is a question being asked in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's a question being asked in North Carolina. It's a question being asked in Minneapolis. It's a question being asked all over this country, because there isn't a single answer. There has to be policy change in order for funds to reach the places that it needs to reach. I'm really proud of the community in Moorhead. I think that the work that you all are doing to defend your public media station is not only incredible but absolutely necessary. One of the things that community members might want to do is really connect with some of the other fights that are happening around the country and work together to try to answer some of those questions, because unfortunately they're not local questions. While the impact is local, the answer is likely federal or state in terms of where resources can come from. The answer is likely an accountability fight, with the entities that actually provide the money. The state is a pass-through. The city is a pass-through. The monies actually, in large measure, come from private corporations. And so we need to figure out how we address the bureaucracy that denies communities the resources they need to communicate. That, to me, is the huge question. At the Center for Media Justice and through the Media Action Grassroots Network, we are creating a community media cohort that will work together to answer some of these questions. I know that with radio, we needed to work with Prometheus Radio and others to pass the Community Radio Act of 2 years ago, which has resulted in a lot of new stations being released from the spectrum. Those are the kinds of policy decisions that then translate into local impact. So we need to figure out what the policy changes that are needed are to make sure that you in Morehead and everyone all over this country has the community media outlets that they need to survive and to thrive. I think that the last thing that I'd like to say here is that your fight in Morehead for quality community media that is funded and that is respected is so important, because transparency, in my opinion, is the anchor of democracy, and community media, like your station in Morehead, is the vehicle for transparency. I am so glad that you are taping these government activities. I'm so glad that your station exists to support the right of your community to communicate, because we can't move our message without our media, and when our right to communicate is violated, in my opinion, we all lose.
The last question that I have is for the public and the listeners, and that is, what are you willing to do to preserve your local public access station and your free speech rights? We at the People's Press Project feel strongly that access to the only public access station afforded to us within the Fargo-Moorhead region should be supporting citizen journalism training, public access programming, and restricting the use of that station arbitrarily to organizations like the People's Press Project or the community is an affront to our free speech rights. Here's what you can do. You can go to change.org and sign our petition. You can find the link on our Facebook site. You can also write a statement or a post at fmppp.org, stands for Fargo-Moorhead People's Press Project, and also on our Facebook page. You can also record a public statement that the PPP can edit and release as part of these podcasts. And finally, you can call the Moorhead City Manager and the MCAM General Manager and demand our rights for public access services at the local public access station. The MCAM General Manager is Tony Tilton. He can be reached at tony@moorheadaccess.tv, or you can call at 218-284-2700. The Moorhead City Manager is Michael Redlinger. He can be reached at Michael, Michael, .Redlinger, REDLINGER, at ci.moorhead.mn.us, or you can call at 218-299-5305. You can also email the board chair of MCAM, Les Bakke, at lesbakke, LESBAKKE, @gmail.com.
Well, amen. Thank you. Thank you for bringing this incredible insight and your experience to this conversation. We really appreciate all of the education that you just laid down on us, and we're going to definitely put it to good use.
Well, I appreciate being invited, and I really wish you a tremendous amount of luck. Please don't hesitate to reach out to the Media Action Grassroots Network, because we are here for you.
Thank you very much, Malkia.
Thank you for listening to this podcast by the People's Press Project.